The Hürtgenwald was never meant to be remembered as a place of glory. It was a dense German forest, full of pine trees and muddy trails, its silence broken only by the wind whistling through the branches. Yet in 1944, this quiet wilderness became a graveyard for thousands of young men who marched into it with orders and hope, but never returned. The faces of those who fought here grew dusty, caked with mud ash, and the exhaustion of endless combat. They entered as soldiers, but the forest stripped them down to something far more fragile. Men gasping for survival, trapped between duty and despair. Each tree became a witness, each shadow a reminder that death lurked just ahead. The title, "The Faces Are Dusty," seems to capture this perfectly, not shining, not heroic, but dulled, broken, and reduced to dust, like forgotten statues in a ruined temple. Hürtgenwald was no grand battlefield of honor. It was a labyrinth where time stretched endlessly, where days blurred into nights, and where every breath might be the last. When American soldiers first entered the Hürtgen Forest in September 1944, they were unprepared for what awaited them. The terrain was unlike anything they had encountered before. Instead of open battlefields, they found themselves in an endless maze of dark pines, thick underbrush, and steep ridges. Visibility was poor. Artillery shells ripped through the treetops, raining down splinters that tore flesh as cruelly as shrapnel. To advance even a few meters cost blood, sweat, and precious lives. The men's faces became masks of exhaustion, covered in grime and powder from constant bombardments. They were dusty not from desert winds, but from the forest soil, churned into clouds by boots, shells, and falling bodies. The fighting was personal, close, suffocating, and unforgiving. Every tree hid a sniper, every path an ambush, every foxhole a shallow grave. And yet orders demanded progress. Soldiers were told the forest had to be cleared before the advance to the Rhine could continue. But in truth, the forest swallowed divisions whole, grinding them into fragments. The enemy was not just German firepower, but also nature itself: mud, rain, cold, and endless fatigue. The German defenders had the advantage of terrain, and they used it with brutal efficiency. The Hürtgenwald was their shield, their fortress. They mined the trails, fortified bunkers into the hills, and dug networks of trenches hidden beneath fallen leaves. For the Americans, every forward step felt like climbing a mountain of resistance. Yet, despite superior numbers and artillery, progress was painfully slow. Soldiers began to understand that they were not fighting for a clear victory, but for survival. Morale dropped as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Entire units were cut off, starving and frozen, unable to evacuate their wounded. "The faces are dusty" could mean more than just the dirt. It spoke to the spirit of these men. Worn down and almost lifeless, their eyes hollow, their expressions blank. Dust is what remains when something is broken, when life has been drained. In the forest, faces became dust because hope was crumbling into despair. The forest was not just a battlefield. It was a slow burial ground where men were not only killed but erased, their identities dissolved into the mud. Winter deepened the nightmare of Hürtgenwald. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow, and the forest became an icy prison. Men huddled in frozen foxholes, their boots soaked, their fingers stiff with frostbite. Medical supplies ran thin, food convoys were ambushed, and the wounded often lay exposed, calling out through the night until silence finally consumed them. For many, death came not from bullets, but from pneumonia, infection, and the sheer cruelty of the elements. The faces of the living mirrored the faces of the dead. Grey, numb, almost indistinguishable from the corpses, buried beneath shallow mounds of snow. Dusty no longer meant dirt alone, but the ash, like pallor of men whose vitality had burned out. The forest did not care about the armies or their cause. It devoured both victor and vanquished alike. Veterans later admitted that they were not fighting for strategy or nation anymore. They fought simply to last another day, another hour, another breath. The WWII Germany reduced human beings to dust in every sense: physical, emotional, spiritual. And though orders still demanded progress, the price was so monstrous that some questioned if any victory here could ever be worth it. One of the cruelest aspects of WWII Germany was its silence between battles. After a barrage or an assault, there would be a stillness that felt suffocating. Soldiers crouched, listening to the creak of branches or the drip of melting snow, each sound amplified into terror. In those pauses, the weight of the forest pressed down like an invisible hand. Men looked at one another and saw the same haunted expressions. Dusty faces marked by fear and resignation. The living looked like ghosts, their uniforms shredded, their helmets dented, their eyes hollow. Letters from home were read and reread until they disintegrated in damp hands. Reminders of a life far away that felt more like a dream than reality. Here in the forest, the only certainty was uncertainty. A man could be laughing in one moment and gone the next, swallowed by an explosion or cut down by a sniper. Soldiers stopped planning for the future had no meaning. In WWII Germany, time shrank to the present moment. The next breath, the next step, the next bullet. Dust clung to their faces because all else, their innocence, their ambitions, their very identities, was stripped away by the forest. Commanders insisted the battle was strategically important. The forest had to be cleared to secure supply lines and prepare for the final push into Germany. But for the soldiers trapped beneath its canopy, strategy meant little. They only saw the blood of their comrades staining the snow, the broken equipment left to rust, and the endless rows of makeshift graves. Whole companies entered the woods and were reduced to a handful of survivors. Reinforcements arrived, but the cycle repeated, new faces becoming dusty, new lives crumbling into dust. The weight of command decisions bore down on ordinary men, many of whom did not even understand why they were ordered to take this particular hill or hold this patch of frozen ground. As days turned into weeks, the forest became a symbol of futility. There was no glory here, no triumphant charge, only grinding attrition. Men began to whisper that the forest was cursed, that it swallowed hope as easily as it swallowed bullets. And perhaps it was true. Because when the battle finally ended, what remained was not victory but desolation. A forest of shadows, dust and silence, haunted forever by those who never left. For those who survived, the memories of WWII Germany never faded. Veterans spoke of the forest not as a battlefield, but as a nightmare stitched into their very bones. Decades later, many could still smell the damp earth, hear the thunder of shells bursting in the treetops, and feel the sting of splinters piercing their skin. Survivors often described the look in their comrades' eyes. The same dusty, hollow gaze that marked every man who trudged through that forest. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and aged years in only a few days. Psychologists would later call it trauma, shell shock, or battle fatigue. But at the time it was simply a condition of existence. The Hürtgenwald didn't just scar the land, it scarred the human spirit. Even victory could not erase the sense of loss. The cost in lives was so heavy, and the strategic gains so minimal, that many asked if the battle should ever have been fought at all. Yet history rarely gives soldiers such choices. They were told to fight, and they did, until the forest had taken everything it demanded. The German soldiers, too, bore the marks of the forest. Though they had the advantage of defense, they were just as human, just as vulnerable to the misery of mud, cold, and hunger. Many of them were young boys or old men pressed into service during the Reich's desperate final months. They fought fiercely, but often with the same fear and fatigue that plagued their opponents. Dust covered their faces as well, a sign of shared suffering on both sides of the line. In the forest, nationality mattered less than endurance. Both American and German troops found themselves prisoners of nature's cruelty, prisoners of decisions made far above them. In rare moments, captured soldiers sometimes spoke to each other and realized how much they had in common. The same longing for home, the same disbelief at being trapped in such a brutal place. The Hürtgenwald was not a story of heroes and villains, but of human beings ground down by an indifferent war machine. The dust did not discriminate, it settled on every face, whether friend or foe. And in that sense, the forest became a great equalizer, turning all men into shadows of themselves. As the weeks dragged on, the forest earned a grim reputation among the Allied troops. Rumours spread like wildfire that no one came out alive, that entire units disappeared into the trees, that the forest itself swallowed men whole. These stories weren't far from the truth. Casualties mounted so high that replacements could barely keep up. New soldiers, fresh from training, entered the Hürtgenwald with nervous determination, only to have their resolve shattered within hours. They joined the ranks of the dusty, faced, their uniforms caked in mud, their expressions dulled by shock. Some described it as a meat grinder, a place where flesh and steel were fed into the forest until nothing remained but fragments. Unlike other famous battles of World War II, Hürtgenwald offered no clear lines of advance, no dramatic breakthroughs, no iconic moments of triumph. It was a war of inches, of trees shattered into kindling, of bodies buried in the soil without ceremony. And this is why its memory lingers like dust. It clings, suffocates, and refuses to be washed away. Soldiers who entered were forever changed, not by victory but by survival itself. The deeper significance of Hürtgenwald lies not only in its military futility, but in the way it revealed the cost of war at its most intimate level. Other battles may be remembered for sweeping maneuvers or decisive outcomes, but here the legacy is the erosion of humanity itself. Every soldier entered the forest as an individual, carrying memories of home, ambitions, and identities. Yet the longer they remained, the more these distinctions eroded. Dust became the common mask, mud on the skin, fatigue in the eyes, despair in the spirit. In this sense, the faces are dusty is not just literal but symbolic. Dust is what remains when fire has consumed everything. It is what the wind scatters when time has passed. The men of Hürtgenwald were not remembered for their names or their triumphs, but for their suffering, for the way the forest ground them into anonymity. The forest did not honour medals, did not record speeches. It reduced all men equally, leaving behind only silence and dust. This, perhaps, is why the story of Hürtgenwald still resonates today, not as a tale of conquest, but as a warning about what war truly does to the human soul. Many who survived struggled to explain the battle when they returned home. Families asked what it was like, but words could not capture the damp cold, the choking mud, the endless artillery, the feeling of being hunted in a forest where even the trees seemed hostile. Veterans often stayed silent, their memories locked away. Others wrote memoirs, but even their descriptions could not convey the full depth of the nightmare. For them, Hürtgenwald was not simply a chapter of war. It was a place where time stopped, where every hour felt like an eternity. Their faces, captured in faded photographs, looked older than their years, etched with lines of exhaustion and grief. The dust of the forest never truly left them. It clung invisibly, in their lungs, in their dreams, in the way they stared into space when asked about the war. And though they walked away physically alive, a part of them remained buried in the soil of that German forest. The battle ended, but the dust endured, passed down through stories, silence, and the haunted look in their eyes that no amount of time could erase. Today, the Hürtgenwald is quiet again. Tourists walk its trails, unaware of the thousands who once fought and died beneath their feet. The trees have grown tall, their branches swaying gently, hiding the scars of war. But beneath the moss and roots lie remnants, rusted helmets, twisted metal, fragments of bone, that remind us of the battle's grim reality. Memorials now stand where men once fell, honoring both sides of the conflict. Yet even in remembrance, there is a strange hush. The forest still feels heavy, as if it remembers, and perhaps it does. Nature has a way of absorbing history, of carrying whispers in the wind and shadows in the soil. When one walks through Hürtgenwald today, it is easy to imagine the faces of those long gone, dusty, hollow, half forgotten, watching from between the trees. They are not heroes in marble or bronze, but ordinary men whose suffering has blended into the forest itself. The dust has become part of the land, inseparable from the soil and the air. And so the forest stands as both a grave and a warning. That war, once unleashed, consumes everything, leaving behind only silence, shadows, and dust. The legacy of Hürtgenwald extends far beyond the soldiers who fought there. It represents the futility of battles, fought at great human cost, with little strategic gain. Historians often describe it as one of the most unnecessary battles of World War II, a campaign that drained men and resources without altering the larger outcome of the war. Yet for those who endured it, the significance was deeply personal. Their memories, their traumas, and their lost comrades became part of the silent history that official reports could never capture. In a way, the dusty faces also symbolize how these men were forgotten by the grand narratives of war. Other battles, Normandy, the Ardennes, Berlin, overshadowed Hürtgenwald. The names of generals and operations were remembered, but the soldiers who froze in their foxholes, who gasped beneath broken trees, faded into obscurity. Dust is what history often does to the ordinary. It covers them, erases them, reduces them to numbers in casualty lists. But in truth, each dusty face carried a story of sacrifice, endurance, and suffering that deserves remembrance. To recall them is to brush away the dust and see the human cost of war with clear eyes once again. Art, literature, and memory have since tried to preserve the essence of what happened in Hürtgenwald. Writers describe it in tones of sorrow. Filmmakers depict its mud and shadows, and veterans' accounts breathe life into the silence that statistics cannot. The phrase, The Faces Are Dusty captures not just the appearance of soldiers in the field, but the fragility of memory itself. Dust settles on photographs, on letters, on helmets placed in museums. It is the slow fading of the past, unless someone chooses to remember. Each generation risks forgetting. Yet the forest still stands as witness. When the wind moves through the pines, one can almost imagine the whispers of the fallen, their voices carried in the rustling branches. In this way, the WWII Germany is not just history, it is a living archive. Its soil and trees infused with the experiences of those who suffered there. To walk its trails today is to walk among ghosts, to feel the weight of lives reduced to dust but not completely erased. Their story, fragile yet enduring, reminds us that the cost of war is always greater than we think, and its echoes never truly disappear. In the end, Hürtgenwald remains a place where the line between the living and the dead feels blurred. The faces are dusty because time has passed, because memory fades, and because war itself reduces everything to ashes and shadows. But dust is also a reminder that what is gone still exists in another form. The soldiers who fought and fell there may not walk the earth anymore, but they remain in the soil, in the trees, in the stories told by survivors and historians. To remember WWII Germany is to honour not only the sacrifice but also the suffering, the exhaustion etched into every face, the silence that followed every battle, the haunting weight carried home by those who survived. The forest has healed on the surface, yet its roots are tangled with human history, soaked in blood and tears. And so, when we say, the faces are dusty, WWII Germany, we are not just describing soldiers caked with mud and fatigue. We are describing the essence of war's cruelty, the way it turns men into dust, and the way memory struggles to keep their humanity alive. Dusty, but not forgotten.